Daniel Brooks stood in front of his bedroom mirror, his reflection framed by the humbleness of the room behind him. A dresser piled high with books, a small television sitting on an uneven stand, and the faint smell of coffee wafting from the kitchen. His gaze dropped to the shirt in his hands, white letters emblazoned on the crimson fabric, Trump 2024. He hesitated. For Daniel, this shirt wasn't just fabric or a political statement. It was a promise one he had made on a hospital bed 2 years ago to his older brother, Jameson, who had spent his life defying expectations. Jameson, a Marine Corps veteran, was an enigma in their family, a staunch Trump supporter despite being acutely aware of the challenges faced by Black Americans in the country. Daniel hadn't agreed with him, not fully, but he had understood his brother's reasoning. Jameson believed in honoring service, discipline, and accountability, values instilled in him by the military, not necessarily politics. Before he passed, Jameson had squeezed Daniel's hand weakly and said, "Wear the shirt for me, little bro, just once." It had taken 2 years for Daniel to muster the courage. Today was that day. He pulled the shirt over his head, feeling the fabric stretch against his chest. When he stepped out of his small apartment, his neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, froze mid-step. Her wide-brimmed sun hat slipped down her graying curls as her eyes scanned his chest. "Well, that's brave of you," she muttered, hurrying toward the stairs. Daniel sighed, locking his door behind him. Brave wasn't the word he'd use, but it was clear the world outside his apartment complex would have its own thoughts about his choice. The town square was buzzing with its usual Saturday morning energy. Vendors shouted about fresh produce and handcrafted jewelry, their voices overlapping in a chaotic but familiar rhythm. Parents guided their children through the crowded paths, dogs barked, and the local coffee shop was swarmed with patrons who lingered for long conversations. It was a scene Daniel had walked through countless times without drawing much attention. Today was different. He felt the eyes on him before he even reached the first stall. A man selling peaches paused mid-bargain with a customer, his eyes narrowing slightly as Daniel walked by. 2 women, standing near a bakery booth, whispered behind their hands. One of them gave a small laugh, her tone tinged with disbelief. Daniel kept his gaze forward, clutching the strap of his backpack tightly. He had promised himself he wouldn't let the shirt define him, but it was hard to ignore the ripple of reactions around him. He wasn't naive, he understood the shirt carried weight, but the sheer intensity of the stares still surprised him. "Daniel, is that you?" The voice belonged to Melissa Grayson, a former high school classmate who now worked as a local news reporter. She approached with cautious curiosity, her camera crew lingering a few feet behind her. "What's going on, Melissa?" Daniel asked, forcing a neutral tone. Melissa's eyes flicked to his shirt, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes crept across her face. "That's an interesting choice of attire." Daniel chuckled dryly. "It's just a shirt." Melissa tilted her head. "You know that's not true. People are going to have questions, Daniel." "And I don't owe them answers," he replied, his voice firm but calm. He stepped past her before she could press further. Behind him, he heard her whisper to her cameraman, "Keep an eye on him." At the heart of the square, a trio of teenage boys had noticed him. They whispered amongst themselves, their smirks and glances unmistakable. One of them, wearing a tattered baseball cap, called out loudly, "Hey bro, didn't think you'd be on that side." Laughter erupted as Daniel walked past, his jaw tightening. He refused to engage. This was exactly why he had hesitated to wear the shirt for so long, because people assumed it spoke louder than he ever could. "Coward," one of them muttered as he passed. The tension in the square grew heavier when Daniel reached a food truck selling tacos. He joined the short line, trying to focus on the aroma of sizzling meat and grilled onions rather than the whispers that continued to swirl around him. As he waited, a man stepped out of the line, moving deliberately toward him. Jake Wheeler. Daniel recognized him immediately, though he hadn't seen Jake in years. They'd gone to the same high school, but their paths couldn't have been more different. Jake was all muscle and bravado, his perpetual scowl a hallmark of his quick temper. Daniel had heard rumors of Jake getting into bar fights, of him lashing out at anyone who crossed him. He also knew Jake prided himself on being one of the few progressive voices in town, someone who loudly denounced racism and bigotry, often to the point of condescension. Jake's eyes were fixed on Daniel's chest. His lip curled in disgust. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. Daniel sighed inwardly but kept his face neutral. "Can I help you?" Jake stepped closer, his face inches away from Daniel's. "Help me? Yeah, you can help me understand what the hell you're doing wearing that trash." "It's just a shirt," Daniel said calmly, though his pulse quickened. "No, it's not," Jake snapped. "That shirt represents everything wrong with this country. And you," he jabbed a finger toward Daniel's chest. "You're a black man. You should know better." The crowd around them had gone silent, the hum of the marketplace replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. "I don't owe you an explanation," Daniel said, his voice steady. "And I don't need your approval." Jake's face reddened. "You're a disgrace. A damn traitor." The word cut through the air like a knife. Daniel felt his anger rising, but he kept it in check. He turned to leave, hoping to defuse the situation. But Jake wasn't done. "You think you can walk around here like that without consequences?" Jake shouted. Before Daniel could react, Jake's foot swung forward, catching Daniel's shin in a forceful kick. Daniel stumbled but didn't fall. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by the sound of someone yelling, "Call the cops." Daniel straightened, his eyes meeting Jake's with an intensity that made the other man falter for a moment. But Daniel didn't retaliate. He simply stood there, his chest rising and falling as he controlled his breathing. "Touch me again," Daniel said, his voice low and measured, "and you'll regret it." The arrival of police officers shattered the standoff. Two uniformed men pushed through the gathering crowd, separating Jake and Daniel. One of them, Officer Reed, gestured for Jake to step aside, while the other approached Daniel. "Sir, are you okay?" the officer asked. Daniel nodded. "I'm fine." Jake, however, was still fuming. "You're arresting the wrong guy if you even think about cuffing me. This man is walking around like some kind of—" "Sir, calm down," Officer Reed interrupted. He turned to the crowd. "Did anyone see what happened?" A middle-aged woman with a cell phone stepped forward. "I recorded the whole thing. He attacked him unprovoked." Jake's jaw dropped as Officer Reed gestured for his partner to detain him. "You can't be serious. He's the problem here." As Jake was led away in handcuffs, Daniel stood in the center of the square, the stares of the crowd still heavy on him. But now, the weight felt different. There was no anger left in his expression, just exhaustion. Melissa and her camera crew reappeared, microphones ready, but Daniel shook his head and walked away, leaving behind a stunned crowd and the echoes of a confrontation that would soon ripple far beyond the borders of the town. Daniel walked briskly away from the crowd that had gathered in the town square, his mind racing. The adrenaline coursing through his veins made him hyper-aware of every step, every breath. The sharp sting in his shin from Jake's kick barely registered. What consumed him was the weight of what had just happened. He had expected whispers and stares, maybe even a few sharp words, but he hadn't anticipated violence nor the chaos that followed it. He turned into a quiet side street, hoping to escape the curious eyes and murmurs that still lingered in the square. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out his phone. A dozen notifications lit up his screen: texts, missed calls, and a flood of social media alerts. Someone must have posted the incident already. He stared at the device for a moment, debating whether to open the messages before sliding it back into his pocket. Not yet. He wasn't ready for what those notifications might hold. The small coffee shop on the corner was a welcome sight. Daniel pushed open the door, the bell above jingling softly. Inside, the familiar hum of espresso machines and the soothing scent of roasted beans wrapped around him like a comforting blanket. A few heads turned as he entered, but no one said anything. He let out a small sigh of relief. This was neutral ground, a space where he could breathe. Daniel called a voice from behind the counter. It was Eric, the shop's owner and an old friend. Eric's warm smile faltered slightly when he saw the tension etched on Daniel's face, and then his eyes dropped to the shirt. Understanding dawned. "Rough morning?" Eric asked, handing Daniel a cup of black coffee without needing to ask his order. You could say that Daniel replied, accepting the cup gratefully. He settled into a seat near the window, the steam from the coffee swirling in the air like a calming rhythm. Eric didn't press for details but gave him a knowing nod before returning to the register. The brief reprieve didn't last long. The sound of the doorbell rang again, sharper this time, as Melissa Grayson entered the shop with her camera crew in tow. She spotted Daniel immediately, her face a mask of determined professionalism. With a gesture, she signaled the cameraman to stay near the door while she approached Daniel. "Daniel, can I have a moment?" Melissa asked, her tone polite but firm. Daniel looked up at her, weary. "Melissa, not now." "I understand, but this is going viral," she pressed. "People are already talking about what happened in the square. If you don't share your side of the story, someone else will control the narrative." He set his cup down carefully, leaning back in his chair. "My side of the story? You mean the part where I wore a shirt and got kicked for it?" Melissa hesitated, her eyes scanning his expression for an opening. "I get that you're upset, but people want to know why you're wearing that shirt, Daniel. You can't pretend this is just about politics." "It's not about politics," Daniel said sharply. "It's personal." "Then tell them," Melissa urged. "If people understood." "Understood what?" Daniel interrupted, his voice rising slightly. He lowered it again, aware of the other patrons glancing their way. "That I'm honoring my brother? That it's not about Trump or Democrats or Republicans? Would that really matter to them, Melissa? Or have they already made up their minds?" Melissa opened her mouth to respond but stopped, her expression softening. "I just think people need to hear your voice in this." Daniel shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "They don't want to hear my voice. They want to tell my story for me. That's the problem." Melissa lingered for a moment, then nodded reluctantly and stepped back. "If you change your mind," she began, but Daniel cut her off with a curt nod, making it clear the conversation was over. She turned to leave, her crew following her out the door. Daniel stared into his coffee, his reflection rippling in the dark liquid. She wasn't entirely wrong. The story was out there now, whether he liked it or not. People would twist it, dissect it, use it to fit their own agendas. He felt the heavy burden of being turned into a symbol, a lightning rod for the town's clowns, and the internet's raging political and racial tensions. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of his phone. Reluctantly, he pulled it out, scrolling through the barrage of notifications. As he feared, a video of the incident was already circulating online. In the clip, Jake's voice was clear and harsh. "You're a disgrace. A damn traitor." The kick came next, and then the shocked gasps of the crowd. Comments flooded in beneath the post, each one a small jab of anger or confusion. Some were supportive. "This is disgusting. The guy didn't even fight back. What happened to free speech? Doesn't matter what shirt he's wearing." Others were far less kind. "Bet he's doing it for attention. Clown. Wearing that shirt was asking for it. You play stupid games." Daniel closed the app, his stomach twisting. The words were just as brutal as the kick had been, if not worse. They carried the weight of strangers' judgments, as if they had the right to decide who he was based on a few seconds of video. The bell above the door jingled again, and Eric came over, leaning on the counter across from Daniel. "You good?" Eric asked, his tone gentle. Daniel hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I will be." Eric studied him for a moment, then clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You let me know if you need anything." As Eric walked away, Daniel felt a flicker of gratitude. At least not everyone was trying to dissect him. But as he finished his coffee, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world outside the coffee shop had already made up its mind about who he was and who he wasn't. The morning sun crept higher, casting light on a town already divided. By the time Daniel left the coffee shop, the incident had morphed from a local altercation into a media frenzy. The town square, now bustling with reporters, activists, and onlookers, bore little resemblance to the familiar space he had walked through just hours before. Yellow police tape sectioned off the area where the confrontation had occurred, and Jake Wheeler's face was plastered across hastily printed flyers labeling him either a hero or a racist aggressor depending on who had made them. Daniel avoided the square, heading toward his apartment instead. The walk home was a gauntlet of pointed stares and cautious whispers. He could feel their questions trailing behind him. Why would he wear that shirt? What was he trying to prove? When he reached his apartment, a small group of people was gathered near the entrance. 2 were reporters, microphones in hand, cameras ready to roll, while the others seemed to be neighbors or curious passers-by. Daniel's heart sank. He had hoped to find solace at home, but it was clear that even here he couldn't escape the storm. Mr. Brooks, one of the reporters, called out, her voice cutting through the chatter. She was young, her blazer crisp, her expression determined. "Do you have a comment about this morning's events?" Daniel didn't respond, keeping his head down as he pushed past the group. "Is it true you've refused to press charges against Jake Wheeler?" another voice shouted. He froze at that. Turning slowly, he met the eyes of the reporter who had asked the question. Her tone was accusatory, her words laced with implication. "I haven't refused anything," Daniel said carefully. "The police haven't even taken my statement yet." Before the woman could respond, he stepped inside and let the door shut firmly behind him. He leaned against it, exhaling deeply. His sanctuary had been breached, and the weight of the outside world pressed against the thin wood separating him from it. Inside, his phone buzzed incessantly on the counter. He hesitated before picking it up. Messages from friends, family, and strangers poured in, each one demanding his attention, his explanation, his side of the story. "Dan, are you okay? Saw the video. Call me." "Bro, what were you thinking with that shirt? Not cool." "I'm praying for you. Don't let them break you. Traitor." The word hit him like a physical blow. He set the phone down, unable to read more. For a moment he simply stood there, his reflection in the blank TV screen staring back at him. Who did they think he was? Did the shirt really matter more than the person wearing it? The knock on the door startled him out of his thoughts. When he opened it, he was greeted by the sight of Lisa Tran, a local civil rights lawyer known for her fiery advocacy and unyielding determination. Her dark hair was tied back, and her expression was a mix of concern and urgency. "Daniel," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." "Lisa," Daniel replied, closing the door behind her. "I didn't call for a lawyer." "No, but you need one," she said, setting her bag on the counter. "This thing is blowing up faster than anyone expected. You're at the center of it, whether you like it or not." Daniel leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I didn't ask to be at the center of anything. I just wanted to—" He stopped himself, unsure how to finish the sentence. "To honor your brother," Lisa said softly. Her words caught him off guard. "Melissa told me. She said it's personal for you." Daniel nodded slowly. "It is. But no one cares about that. They've already made me a symbol for something I don't even believe in." "Exactly," Lisa said, her voice sharpening. "That's why you need to get ahead of this. If you don't tell your story, they'll tell it for you, and trust me, you won't like their version." Daniel looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't want to be a part of this circus." Lisa stepped closer, her gaze intense. "You think you have a choice? You were assaulted in broad daylight for wearing a shirt. That's a national story now, Daniel. Whether you like it or not, people are watching, and the way you handle this will set the tone for how they remember it." By afternoon, the fallout from the incident had reached new heights. Social media was ablaze with debates, hashtags, and commentary from people who had never met Daniel or Jake but felt compelled to weigh in. The local police department held a press conference to address the situation. Chief Warren, a grizzled man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stood at the podium, flanked by officers. "We are conducting a full investigation into the events that took place in the town square this morning," he said. "Jake Wheeler has been taken into custody and is being charged with assault. We are also reviewing the circumstances surrounding the incident, including any potential underlying motivations." A reporter raised her hand. "Chief Warren, can you confirm reports that Mr. Brooks was wearing a Trump shirt at the time of the altercation?" The chief's jaw tightened. "That is correct." "And do you believe that the shirt provoked the attack?" Chief Warren's eyes narrowed. "There is no justification for violence, regardless of what someone is wearing. We urge everyone to remain calm and allow the investigation to proceed." Meanwhile, Jake Wheeler's lawyer, Paul Winthrop, was building a defense. Known for his slick suits and sharper tongue, Winthrop wasted no time framing Jake as a victim of political provocation. "My client reacted emotionally to a highly charged situation," he said during an impromptu interview outside the courthouse. "We're confident that when all the facts come to light, people will understand that this was not a racially motivated attack, but a misunderstanding fueled by heightened emotions and divisive politics." The words set off a firestorm. Commentators on the right seized on the narrative, accusing Daniel of deliberately stirring up trouble by wearing the shirt. On the left, activists decried the framing as an attempt to excuse a clear act of racial violence. In his apartment, Daniel watched it all unfold in stunned silence. Every channel, every platform was dissecting his life, his choices, his motives. It was like watching a version of himself he didn't recognize play out on screen. Lisa sat across from him, her laptop open as she scrolled through the latest updates. "We need to make a statement," she said, "something that puts the focus back on what really matters." "And what's that?" Daniel asked bitterly. "The fact that I got kicked for wearing a shirt, or the fact that everyone's decided I'm either a hero or a villain because of it?" Lisa closed her laptop, her expression softening. "The fact that you're human, Daniel, and that this," she gestured to the chaotic headlines on the screen, "isn't who you are." Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. "And if I don't say anything, then they'll decide who you are for you," Lisa said simply. The decision weighed heavily on him as the day stretched into evening. He thought of Jameson, of the promise he had made and the storm it had unleashed. As he stood on the balcony of his apartment, staring out at the darkening sky, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. Daniel's decision to stay silent didn't last long. The cacophony outside his apartment, the reporters, the relentless phone buzz, and the distant hum of online debates grew unbearable. By the next morning, Lisa was back, a cup of coffee in one hand and a determined look in her eyes. "We need to do this, Daniel," she said, setting the coffee on the counter and pulling out her laptop. "A press statement, an interview, something to put your voice out there." "I didn't ask to be a spokesperson," Daniel muttered, rubbing his temples. "And yet here you are," Lisa replied, her tone unwavering. "This isn't about the shirt anymore. It's about what it represents. People need context. Daniel, your context." Daniel didn't respond right away. He paced the small living room, his mind a whirlwind of doubt. The shirt, the attack, the chaos that followed, it had all spun out of control so quickly. How could a story so deeply personal be twisted into a public spectacle? Finally, he stopped pacing and faced Lisa. "Fine," he said. "I'll talk, but on my terms." That afternoon, Daniel sat in the town library's modest meeting room, where Lisa had arranged for Melissa Grayson to conduct the interview. Melissa, to her credit, looked both nervous and eager. She greeted Daniel with a small smile before glancing at the crew behind her. The cameras were set up, microphones adjusted, and the lighting focused squarely on Daniel's chair. "You sure you're ready for this?" Melissa asked quietly. "No," Daniel admitted, sitting down. "But let's do it anyway." The cameras rolled, and Melissa dove in gently, starting with questions about Daniel's background, his life in the town, his family, and his work as a graphic designer. She was careful to build rapport before broaching the more contentious topics. "Daniel," she said, her tone softening, "I think what a lot of people want to know is, why the shirt? Why wear something you knew might provoke people?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to his hands. "It wasn't about politics," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "It was about my brother." Melissa tilted her head slightly. "Your brother?" "Jameson," Daniel said, a faint smile crossing his lips at the mention of the name. "He was a Marine. Served 2 tours overseas. He loved this country fiercely, even when it didn't always love him back. And he loved Trump. Not for the man himself, but for what he thought Trump stood for: loyalty, strength, and a willingness to challenge the status quo." Melissa listened intently as Daniel continued, his voice growing more certain with each word. "We argued about it all the time," Daniel admitted. "I didn't agree with everything he believed in, and I told him that. But Jameson, he was stubborn. He believed in his values with everything he had. And when he got sick, when we knew he wasn't going to make it, he asked me to wear the shirt. Just once. To remember him and honor the things he stood for." Melissa's eyes softened. "And that's why you wore it yesterday." Daniel nodded. "It wasn't about Trump. It wasn't about making a statement. It was about keeping a promise to my brother. That's all." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Daniel's words settling over everyone. Melissa glanced at her notes but didn't look back up immediately. She was clearly processing the depth of what he had shared. "Do you regret it?" she finally asked. "Do I regret honoring my brother?" Daniel replied, his gaze steady. "No, but I do regret how the world reacted. I regret that a promise I made to someone I loved has been turned into something ugly." Melissa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "What would you want people to take away from this, Daniel? What's the message you'd like to share?" Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "I'd want them to stop jumping to conclusions, to stop assuming they know someone based on a snapshot of their life or a piece of clothing they wear. I'd want them to see the person, not just the symbol." The interview concluded quietly, with Melissa thanking Daniel for his time. As the crew packed up their equipment, Lisa approached him, a look of pride on her face. "You did good, Daniel," she said. "Really good." "I hope so," he replied, his tone subdued. "I don't know if it'll change anything, though." "It might not," Lisa admitted. "But at least now your voice is out there. And that's what matters." The interview aired that evening, quickly making its way onto social media and local news outlets. The response was immediate and divided. While many praised Daniel's courage and vulnerability, others dismissed his explanation, accusing him of using his brother's memory to justify bad optics. Daniel tried to focus on the positives. Messages of support from strangers trickled in, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. A local veterans group reached out, thanking him for honoring his brother's service. But for every kind word, there were two more that stung. "You're just making excuses for supporting a racist. This doesn't change the fact that you wore that shirt. Still a traitor in my eyes." Daniel closed his laptop, leaning back against the couch with a weary sigh. No matter how hard he tried to explain, some people would never see past their own biases. But he wasn't doing this for them. He was doing it for Jameson and for himself. As the night deepened, Daniel stood by the window, gazing out at the quiet street below. The world outside was as turbulent as ever, but inside he felt a small flicker of peace. He had spoken his truth, and for now that was enough. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustle of papers and the occasional murmur from the gallery. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded in his lap, his expression calm but unreadable. Across the room, Jake Wheeler fidgeted in his seat, his lawyer whispering instructions into his ear. The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Harper, a stern woman with sharp eyes, read over the final details of the case. The trial had lasted weeks, during which the entire town and much of the country had followed every detail with bated breath. The prosecution had painted Jake as a violent man who had allowed his prejudices to boil over into an unprovoked attack. The defense, however, argued that Jake's actions had been fueled by political frustration, not racial hatred, and claimed he had been provoked by what they called a deliberate act of political antagonism on Daniel's part. Daniel had sat through it all with quiet dignity, answering questions when necessary but refusing to let the spectacle consume him. Lisa had been a steadfast presence at his side, her sharp arguments cutting through the defense's attempts to shift blame. But as the jury filed back into the courtroom, even Lisa looked tense. The foreman stood, holding the verdict in his hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jake Wheeler, guilty of assault." A collective exhale swept through the room. Jake slumped in his seat, his face pale, while his lawyer immediately began whispering about an appeal. Daniel remained still, his gaze fixed on the judge as she outlined the next steps. "Mr. Wheeler," Judge Harper said, her voice firm, "you will serve 6 months in county jail, followed by 1 year of probation. Additionally, you will participate in a restorative justice program as recommended by the court." The words hung in the air, and Daniel felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but the scars of the incident remained for both of them. After the gavel fell, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs and the shuffle of people rising from their seats. Reporters scrambled to get comments from both sides. Lisa guided Daniel out a side exit, shielding him from the onslaught of microphones and cameras. Outside, the crisp afternoon air felt refreshing against Daniel's skin. He paused on the courthouse steps, staring at the small crowd gathered below. Some held signs of support justice for Daniel, while others clutched placards accusing him of race baiting and divisiveness. "You okay?" Lisa asked, her voice cutting through the noise. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." Lisa smiled faintly, then glanced at the crowd. "You want to say something?" He hesitated. He had avoided addressing the public directly throughout the trial, relying on Lisa to handle statements. But now, standing on these steps with the weight of the verdict behind him, he felt ready. Daniel stepped forward, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. The voices gradually died down, and all eyes turned to him. "I didn't come here today to divide this community," he began, his voice steady and clear. "I didn't wear that shirt to make a political statement or to provoke anyone. I wore it because of a promise I made to my brother. A promise that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with family." He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. "This isn't about choosing sides. It's about choosing to see each other as people first. We're more than the labels we wear, more than the assumptions we make about each other. And if we can't move past those assumptions, then we're stuck in a cycle that hurts everyone." The crowd was silent, many nodding, others visibly skeptical. But Daniel didn't need their unanimous approval. He only needed to speak his truth. "I'm moving forward," he concluded. "I hope the rest of you will too." As Daniel walked away from the courthouse, flanked by Lisa and a few close friends, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew that. The scars of what had happened, both visible and invisible, would take time to heal. But for the first time since that fateful morning in the town square, he felt like he could finally take the first step. Jake's lawyer approached them briefly as they reached the parking lot. "Mr. Brooks," he said, his tone formal but not unfriendly, "my client has expressed interest in meeting with you privately, part of the restorative justice program. No cameras, no media, just the two of you." Daniel glanced at Lisa, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He turned back to the lawyer and nodded slowly. "Tell him I'm willing." Later that week, in a quiet room at a community center, Daniel and Jake sat across from each other for the first time since the trial. There were no reporters, no lawyers, no audience, just two men, their differences laid bare. Jake looked nervous, his hands gripping the edges of the table. "Look," he began, his voice shaky, "I don't know what I can say that'll make this better. I screwed up. I let my anger get the best of me, and I hurt you. I'm sorry." Daniel studied him for a moment before replying. "Why did it bother you so much?" Jake hesitated, then shrugged helplessly. "I don't know, I guess I thought you were trying to rub it in our faces, like you were saying we were wrong, that everything I've been fighting against was a joke." And now Daniel asked. Jake's shoulders slumped. "Now I know I was wrong. About you. About a lot of things." The conversation continued, slowly and awkwardly, but with each exchange, a little of the tension lifted. By the end of the session, Jake extended a tentative hand. Daniel shook it. That handshake wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a beginning. For Daniel, it was a small step toward healing for himself, for Jake, and for a community still grappling with its divides. As he left the center that evening, he glanced up at the stars, a sense of quiet peace settling over him. He had kept his promise to his brother, and in doing so, he had found a way to move forward. The weeks following the trial passed slowly but steadily, like the town itself was exhaling a collective sigh. The courthouse steps were empty now, the reporters had moved on, and the town square had returned to its usual rhythm of Saturday markets and casual strolls. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Conversations that once felt taboo were now bubbling to the forefront, and people who had never considered the weight of their assumptions were beginning to take a closer look at themselves. Daniel Brooks sat on a worn bench at the edge of the park, his hands cradling a cup of coffee. The morning air was crisp, tinged with the faint scent of pine and freshly cut grass. Children's laughter echoed from the nearby playground, a stark contrast to the tension that had once dominated this space. He watched as a group of volunteers hung banners along the park's walkway. Community Day, building bridges, not walls. The event was the brainchild of Lisa Tran, who had convinced the town council to sponsor it. She'd called Daniel the night before, insisting he attend, but he had hesitated. Being thrust into the spotlight had never been his goal, and he was still learning how to navigate his new role as a reluctant local figurehead. But as he sat there, watching the diverse crowd of vendors, performers, and families gather, he felt a small flicker of hope. "Didn't think I'd see you here," a familiar voice said, pulling him from his thoughts. Daniel turned to see Jake Wheeler approaching cautiously, hands shoved into his jacket pockets. Jake's posture was less defensive than it had been during the trial, his face softer, almost unsure. Daniel gestured to the empty spot on the bench. "It's a public park." Jake sat down slowly, leaving a noticeable gap between them. For a moment, neither man spoke. The sounds of the event filled the silence between them, a band tuning their instruments, vendors calling out their deals, children shrieking with delight as they raced through the grass. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "I started volunteering at the food bank last week, part of the restorative justice program." Daniel nodded but said nothing, letting Jake continue. "I didn't know how many people around here were struggling," Jake admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "I guess I just never paid attention before." "That's the problem," Daniel said quietly. "Most people don't pay attention until it's personal." Jake flinched but didn't argue. He glanced at the coffee in Daniel's hands, then at the crowd gathering for the event. "You're braver than me, you know, facing all this head on." Daniel let out a soft laugh. "It's not bravery. It's necessity. I didn't have a choice." Jake hesitated, then nodded. "I guess none of us really do." As the day unfolded, Daniel found himself pulled into conversations he hadn't expected. A young black woman approached him with tears in her eyes, thanking him for standing up against prejudice. An older white couple shook his hand, apologizing for their initial judgment. Each interaction chipped away at the isolation Daniel had felt since the incident, reminding him that while the world could be harsh, it was also capable of growth. One of the more surprising moments came when Mrs. Caldwell, his neighbor, stopped by his table with a plate of cookies. "I've been meaning to talk to you," she said, her voice warm but tentative. "I misjudged you that morning. I assumed the worst, and that was wrong of me." Daniel smiled, accepting the plate. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell. It means a lot." She lingered for a moment before adding, "For what it's worth, I think Jameson would be proud of you." Her words hit Daniel harder than he expected, and he had to take a moment to compose himself. "Thank you," he said again, his voice softer. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the park, Lisa Tran took the stage to deliver a short speech. She spoke passionately about the importance of community, empathy, and the power of confronting uncomfortable truths. When she called Daniel up to say a few words, he hesitated, his instinct to avoid the spotlight kicking in. But as the crowd turned to him, their faces filled with anticipation and respect, he realized this was no longer just about him. It was about all of them, about the connections being rebuilt, the walls being broken down. Daniel stood, walking to the microphone. He cleared his throat, the noise of the crowd quieting instantly. "I've been thinking a lot about what's happened these past few months," he began, his voice steady. "About the shirt, the trial, and everything that came with it. And I've realized something important. None of us are just one thing. We're not just a shirt, a label, or a headline. We're people, complicated, flawed, and sometimes contradictory." He paused, scanning the crowd. "What happened to me was about more than politics or race. It was about fear of what we don't understand, fear of being wrong, fear of change. But fear doesn't have to define us. We have the power to choose empathy instead, to listen, to learn, and to grow." The crowd erupted into applause as Daniel stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding. For the first time since that fateful morning in the town square, he felt truly at peace. The event wound down as dusk settled over the park. Daniel lingered near the edge of the crowd, watching families pack up their picnic blankets and vendors close their stalls. Lisa approached him, a satisfied smile on her face. "You were amazing up there," she said. Daniel shrugged. "I just said what I felt." And that's exactly what people needed to hear. Later that night, Daniel drove to the cemetery, the events of the day still fresh in his mind. He parked near his brother's grave, the headlights casting long shadows across the grass. In his hand, he held the shirt, the one that had started it all. The fabric was faded now, its colors dulled by countless washes, but it still held the same weight, the same promise. Kneeling by Jameson's headstone, Daniel placed the shirt gently at its base. The cool night air wrapped around him as he sat there, his thoughts drifting. "I kept my promise, Jameson," he said softly. "I hope I made you proud." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a quiet sense of closure. For the first time, Daniel felt like he could move forward not as a symbol or a victim, but as himself. He stood, brushing the dirt from his knees, and turned to leave. As he walked back to his car, the stars above seemed a little brighter, the world a little lighter, and for Daniel Brooks that was enough.